Afternoon, and welcome to the 2017 version of the Andy Talks. Someone told me there's something called TED Talks. I sort of remember hearing something about that. Well, we think they stole the idea from us, from our Andy Talks. The ground rules for our speakers are just keep it to no longer than 18 minutes. Sorry, but no Q&A. These are supposed to be sort of quick-hitting, to the point comments on a topic about which the speakers are passionate, and that's the key. They can talk about anything they want. Of course, it's related to their research, but the one thing that it has to display is passion. So without further ado, our first speaker is Karen Clay, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at our Heinz College. Professor Clay received her bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia and her PhD at Stanford. After teaching a few years at the University of Toronto, she joined the Heinz College in 1999. Karen.
Thank you for coming to my Andy Talk. I'm going to talk today about the social and economic costs of transporting crude oil. And because I was a little concerned about engaging the audience after lunch, I decided to add a movie reference. So if you've seen the movie The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, it's a Clint Eastwood movie. And the three main characters learn early on in the film about a large cache of gold coins. And so they spend the entire film basically seeking the cache, and at the end they find it. So this talk is really about our quest to find answers to our research questions. And at the end, as you'll see, we did find answers. Our story begins in North Dakota in the 1950s and even earlier. North Dakota is producing oil. They're producing relatively small amounts of oil, and so there's a commensurately small amount of infrastructure in North Dakota to do the refining. It continues on that way until we get to the mid-2000s, when suddenly we hit the fracking revolution, and there's a dramatic increase in the amount of crude oil being produced in North Dakota. This is a picture of the Bakken Formation, and the Bakken Formation is where most of the oil in North Dakota is coming these days, and this is located covering a sort of larger geographic area. Now I want you to imagine a map of the United States, and think about where North Dakota is relative to that. Basically, you're going to have to move crude oil a very long distance in order to make it reach the refinery capacity, which largely exists on the East Coast, the West Coast, and the Gulf Coast. And so that's where the social and economic costs of moving crude oil are going to appear. Now, here's an example of a social cost. This is from the worst disaster in crude by rail history. It occurred in July 2013 in Lac-Mégantic in Quebec, and 47 people were killed. The entire town was more or less leveled, and more than $1 billion of damages were done. And so I think people looked at this and were horrified, and suddenly the risks of moving crude oil by rail were sort of propelled to national and international sort of recognition. People are suddenly very concerned about this issue. This is another kind of disaster that occurred from crude oil. This particular one happened in North Dakota in December 2016. This was out of the Belforche pipeline, and there were 180,000 gallons of crude oil that spilled into the Ashkoolie Creek. And I think if you look at this picture, the thing that's sort of striking is most people are going to think, is that going into my drinking water? Ironically, this occurred about 150 miles from the Standing Rock Reservation, where there were protests throughout the summer and fall of 2016. And indeed, you can see that one of the central issues in that set of protests had to do with the threats to drinking water from the proposed pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline. Now, we were concerned that there was a lot of media attention, but no one was attaching numbers to these risks. We wanted to know both what were the absolute levels of risk and what were the relative levels of risk in order to better think about the social and economic costs. Now, here's an example of a fully loaded crude oil unit train coming out of the Bakken. And by comparison to those other pictures, this picture looks pretty benign, right? It's a long train, but it's not on fire. And the locomotives are not emitting large clouds of black smoke. But the thing that you should recognize is, despite the fact that you can't see it, the 3 diesel locomotives who are pulling this train, there's 2 in the front and 1 in the back, so the 3 diesel locomotives are emitting large quantities of air pollution as they pull the oil along the route. Now, this is a picture of a crude oil pumping station, and again, it looks kind of cool and space-agey, and it certainly doesn't look particularly threatening. But what you can't see is that it's drawing very large amounts of electricity, and much of that electricity is coming from coal-fired power plants. So it too is emitting a fair amount of air pollution. So we were concerned that people were extremely focused on the spill and accident costs, and that they were overlooking these sort of nearly invisible but important, or at least potentially important, health risks coming from air pollution. So now we're getting sort of to the beginning of the movie. So you can see Clint Eastwood, and the 3 characters then set off on their journey to find some answers, and I thought you might actually find it sort of entertaining to see a picture of our team as well. So here we are, me, Akshay Jha, Nick Muller, and Randy Walsh. And we're going to set off to answer 4 questions. We want to know, what are the spill and accident costs for rail? What are the spill and accident costs for pipelines? What are the air pollution costs for rail? And what are the air pollution costs for pipelines? We got lucky. So if you think about this as the movie, almost right off the bat, we find a key piece of information, and it comes from the Department of Transportation Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. So they govern movements of crude oil both by pipeline and by rail because crude oil is considered a hazardous material. And although no one was talking about these reports, they had actually commissioned 2 really detailed analyses as parts of RIAs, regulatory impact analyses, one having to do with movement by rail and one having to do with movement by pipeline. And deep within those reports, if you wade through the hundreds of pages of detailed analysis, what you can find are numbers. And we were able to do some transformation in order to make these numbers sort of similar to each other, comparable, and then comparable to what we're eventually going to find for our air pollution numbers. So these are the numbers for spill and accident costs. The thing you want to notice is that rail is $381 per million barrel miles. You might wonder, what's a million barrel mile? It's literally what you would think. It's moving 1 million barrels of oil 1 mile, or moving 1 barrel of oil 1 million miles. If you are not used to thinking about these things in these terms, you should think about the costs from rail being about 1.5 cents per gallon of crude oil, right? Not per gallon of gasoline, per gallon of crude oil, and the cost per pipeline being about 0.25 cents per gallon. Now, that was the first 20 minutes of the movie, and if you've watched the movie, you know that they spend a lot of time wandering around, gathering information, going down dead ends, and eventually ending up at the grave of Art Stanton, and then subsequently discovering that the gold is actually hidden in the unknown grave next door. We similarly, and I'm not going to take you through it in real time because it would take the rest of 2 hours, but basically we spent a huge amount of time wandering the wilderness, consuming blog posts, trade publication, government reports, talking on the phone to people in state government, federal government, anyone who would talk to us, and a bunch of people who eventually quit returning our phone calls because we had so many questions. One key piece of information that was would enable us to do some of the estimates that we have came from the Surface Transportation Board. We had access to their confidential waybill sample. This confidential waybill sample is going to give you origin and destination county, some interchange points, the carrier, which is going to help us identify the rail line, and the tonnage that's being carried, which we can then convert into barrels. This is going to allow us to construct maps that look very much like this map from the Wall Street Journal. What I want you to notice from this map is that there is oil going to the East Coast, to the West Coast, and to the Gulf Coast. There's a particularly heavily traveled route out of the Bakken going through Minneapolis, Chicago, across northern Indiana and Ohio, and then splitting in Pennsylvania, part of it going through southern Pennsylvania and part of it going through northern Pennsylvania. One of the things that creating these types of maps has allowed us to do is to actually identify for every county the amount of rail length, but also the volume that's going through that particular county. On the pipeline side, we actually bought data from an industry data provider called Genscape, and they place these kinds of monitors under power lines that go into crude oil pumping stations. They monitor the power draws in order to keep track of what's happening with the pipeline flows. For our purposes, what we were really interested in was just taking those data and aggregating them up to the monthly and then to the annual level, because our analysis is going to focus on 2014. This is just a picture of the pipeline infrastructure in the United States. You'll see that oil that's coming out of the Bakken is basically going to head south to the Gulf, in part because there's almost no pipeline infrastructure going to either the East Coast or to the West Coast. It's typically going through either Cushing or Patoka and then down to Houston and Louisiana. Okay, so we've gathered all this information and we're finally ready to do the analysis. So on the locomotive side, as I told you, for every county, we actually calculate the number of barrel miles through that county, which allows us to actually get diesel consumption. We're going to pair that with diesel emission factors from 2014 for the fleet. And then we're going to feed it into an air quality model, right? Because the emission factors are pollutants, but those pollutants then go up and recombine into other forms of air pollution. So we put it into an air quality model. This model is going to take into account the fact that the emissions happen in a particular county but may affect adjacent counties as well. And it's going to be combined then with population, property, and crop information to give us air pollution costs. For the pumping stations, we're going to take these electricity draws and we're going to use a model that tells us which power plants turn on. We're going to use those power plant emission factors. And that's going to, again, allow us to put this stuff into the air quality model and give us some air pollution costs. It's also going to take into account the fact that rail emissions happen at ground level and power plant emissions happen much higher up and so have a much broader effect. Okay, so we've kind of gotten to nearly the end of the movie, right, when they discover the gold, and you can see that he's very happy. I should have put a picture of our smiling faces, although perhaps we were too exhausted. So here's what I want you to focus on, right? You see the spill and accident costs that we saw initially. The air pollution costs are much bigger, right? 9 times bigger. So that suggests that these air pollution costs, although people are not necessarily focused on them, are really important and should be included in policy. The other thing you can see is that moving things by rail is much more socially costly than moving it by pipeline. Okay, so just to give you a sense of the magnitude, if you look at the rail number, which is $3,825, right, $3,825, $3,825. That's about 15.7 cents per gallon of crude oil. And if you don't think about these things, this is a big number, right? We want to take that into account in terms of making sure that firms are facing the full social and economic costs of their activities. So you might say, well, okay, you've got these numbers. What are we going to do with these numbers? If we actually had firms face these costs, that is, they actually had to account for the air pollution costs and the spill and accident costs, what would happen? Well, some things might get moved by rail, but they might get moved through less densely populated areas, which would reduce the cost, right? Because you're exposing fewer people to air pollution. Some of it might get shifted to pipelines, but if you know something about this, you may also know that most pipelines are pretty close to capacity. So the other thing that might happen is you might see some new pipeline infrastructure being built. The other thing you might wonder about is this policy relevant anymore? Because if you look at the green line, you see that crude oil goes way up, crude oil by rail, and then it comes way down. But if you look at the blue line is ethanol. Ethanol remains stable and high. You can also see propane. Propane is sort of gradually increasing. There's some other things that are not on this graph, like butane and isobutane and things like that, which you should think of as being about the same magnitude as propane. All of these things face the same kinds of trade-offs. That is, we would want them to think about whether it's more effective to either shift rail to less densely populated areas or potentially to pipelines. Ethanol currently doesn't move via pipeline very often, but there are some demonstration pipelines, and in fact, there have been some proposed pipelines, so it's clearly feasible. So we think that these numbers are both relevant for crude oil by rail and crude oil by pipeline, but more broadly for these types of products. Okay, so thank you for your attention. We have kind of reached the end of the movie, and we return you to North Dakota.